If they don't pay, I'm not going to defend them. No, I'm not going to defend them.
What if NATO collapsed tomorrow? For over 70 years, NATO has been the backbone of Western security. It has deterred Russian aggression, stabilized Europe, and kept the US close to its allies. Behind this organized security alliance, the US has shared a huge chunk of the annual budget for decades. However, the tides are shifting, and Donald Trump is here to change the game. In his recent statement, Trump warned that the US might leave NATO if allies didn't pay their bills. So what happens if the US walks away and NATO collapses all of a sudden, with no US military support, joint defense, or Article 5 protection? What would be the immediate consequences of this collapse? Would Europe head towards chaos with far more dangerous consequences? And more importantly, would the world be safer or on the brink of another global conflict? Let's have a look. A brief historical perspective.
This union of 12 nations became known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or more simply, NATO. They were sworn to stand together against aggression. An attack against one would be an attack against all.
It was the year 1949, and the world was recovering from the devastation of World War II. Europe was in ruins with its economy shattered, and a new threat was rising in the East in the form of the Soviet Union. With memories of war still fresh, Europe needed a shield that could counter Soviet expansion. And so, NATO came into being in 1949 with the United States, Canada, and several Western European nations. But it wasn't just a defensive framework, it was a symbol of unity that tied the US with Europe in a way that went beyond military alliance to global partners in every aspect. For a better purpose, America wasn't just protecting Europe, but also making sure that Western democracy prevailed. Fast forward to today, the Cold War is over, and NATO remains the cornerstone of Western security. It has expanded and even intervened in conflicts beyond Europe. But here's the problem, the world has changed and every member of NATO sees things differently. Some member countries see NATO as a financial burden. That's why, once a powerful alliance is now struggling to keep up. There are growing cracks in NATO due to internal conflicts, financial disputes, and political tensions, which make its collapse even more obvious. At a glance, NATO seems a solid alliance with big powers holding it together, but beneath the surface, it isn't that united front as it seems. So, before we disclose what's really going wrong, let's have a look at how cracks are growing in NATO and what they mean for the future of the alliance. The first crack among many, and the main bone of contention, is the share of NATO's defense spending. The growing cracks in NATO.
They should up their 2% to 5%.
Disputes on defense spending. Trump has repeatedly criticized NATO members for not meeting the goal of spending 2% of their GDP on defense. He sees Europe riding free on American military protection while spending less on its own defenses. Not only that, he has also threatened to withdraw support for NATO if members don't pay their fair share. With that in mind, the US is considering a policy change to prioritize military exercises with NATO members who are spending a set percentage of their GDP. The Trump administration has already signaled that the US could reduce its military presence in Europe. As the US contributes a whopping 16% of NATO's annual budget, Trump believes the country is paying too much. Recently, he said NATO members should raise defense spending to 5% of GDP. However, some European leaders think otherwise. Some of them claim that these huge funds could be better spent on domestic projects like healthcare, infrastructure, and social welfare. That is the reason there are growing cracks among NATO members over security issues as well as domestic priorities. Interestingly, that's not the only loophole that could threaten NATO unity in the future. Other regional issues also widen these security gaps. Turkey and Greece share the same example. Turkey-Greece tensions. Both being NATO members, Turkey and Greece have been at loggerheads for decades over territorial and airspace claims. Turkey's military presence in northern Cyprus has led to frequent diplomatic standoffs and military clashes. Their deep-rooted friction almost brought them to war 3 times in the last 50 years. So if any unlikely war breaks out between them, then it would surely disrupt NATO unity. Many experts claimed that if hostilities escalated, then Russia could take advantage of the situation. Ultimately, it would lead to a regional war in which Europe would be directly involved. Besides that, there is another challenge that could add to NATO's woes. That is Hungary's pro-Russian stance. Hungary's stance. In recent years, Hungary has emerged as a focal point in European security and the balance of power on the continent. While Hungary is part of the EU and NATO, the country has served as Russia's Trojan horse in its war in Ukraine. Since the war in Ukraine, Hungary has been resisting the EU's defense initiatives and adopting policies that align with Russian interests. In a recent move, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán stated that Budapest would not provide soldiers or military supplies to Kyiv. This is because Hungary is heavily reliant on Russia's energy supplies and aid packages. If Budapest sides with the EU, then it would obviously mean it is pushing away Russian oil and gas contracts. Moreover, Orbán has criticized Western policies as harmful to Hungary's national interests. This defiance has made Hungary a thorn in the EU's side and a pro-Russian voice in NATO's flanks. This development is a sign of possible fault lines in NATO that could bring serious geopolitical consequences for Europe. With these challenges, Trump's threat to withdraw from NATO could land a final blow. But before the US could change the whole scenario, French President Emmanuel Macron sent shockwaves through Europe with a controversial headline: EU's push for military autonomy. In January 2025, Macron said that Europe should not buy American weapons and rather invest in homegrown defense industries. He stressed that Europe should spend more to subsidize the defense industry and replace American weapons with domestic ones. It's a shocking development if it happens. The question is, why did this significant push happen all of a sudden? The reason is that European leaders are afraid of Trump's policies and his handling of the security alliance. They risk being sidelined in global security decisions if they do nothing to counter Trump's policies. On the flip side, this move directly challenges US dominance in NATO, as Washington has poured billions of dollars into European security. If Europe shifts away from American influence, then it could fuel tensions within the alliance. Not only that, but Europe could lose billions of dollars of US support in defense. Ultimately, Russia's threat could increase further when the US is gone, so Macron's push for independence could fracture NATO and further reshape the balance of power within the alliance. Change in Article 5. Not just the balance of power, NATO's strength has always counted on one fundamental promise: an attack on one member is an attack on all. But now, that very foundation is starting to crack. You see, NATO's collective defense, or Article 5, is the very heart of its founding treaty. It means that an attack against one ally is considered an attack against all allies. However, Trump's recent remarks sent shockwaves through the alliance when he said that the US will not defend its NATO allies if they don't pay enough. This statement rings alarm bells for NATO's collective defense strategy and also for NATO's future. It raises the question that if the world's most powerful military starts putting a price tag on security, then how united is that alliance really? As tensions build, the unbelievable scenario looks possible. This shows that NATO's collapse is not a hypothetical scenario. Rather, it seems reality in today's world. So what if NATO falls out? What would be the immediate consequences on Europe and the whole world? Immediate consequences and chaos. If NATO collapses tomorrow, the geopolitical landscape will shift dramatically. First of all, Europe would lose its collective defense strategy, thus creating an immediate power vacuum. The US global influence, which was largely based on the transatlantic alliance, would face a major blow. Without NATO, Washington would lose its direct control over Europe, leaving a power vacuum that Russia and China would rush to fill. So Moscow and Beijing would be the ultimate geopolitical winners of Trump's choice to withdraw from the alliance. But what about Europe? Well, Eastern European nations would be more vulnerable as they have long relied on Article 5 as a resistance against Russian aggression. The Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania would be on high alert, fearing a Russian invasion at any time. On top of that, with NATO gone, Russia would grab this opportunity to expand its influence by taking control over former Soviet states through military encroachments, as it has done in Crimea in the past and now in Ukraine. For Russia, NATO's collapse wouldn't just be a victory, but an eventual jackpot. Without NATO's unified defenses, the Kremlin could push boundaries without any fear of a quick military response from European powers. On the other hand, Europe will be divided and at the mercy of Russia, which would soon cement its position as a Eurasian power. The West's decades-old stronghold would be gone, and Russia would enjoy the spoils. Meanwhile, China would also rethink its strategic ambitions in Taiwan. After NATO's collapse, the US would be taken as weaker as Europe wouldn't be, on its back protecting its interests. That would give China a bright opportunity to increase its influence in the Indo-Pacific region. Moreover, NATO's absence would cause regional powers like Iran, Turkey, and North Korea to behave more aggressively. All in all, the sudden collapse of the world's most powerful military alliance could lead to global instability and reshape alliances. But the consequences wouldn't just be military. The economic effects would also be devastating on the global markets and financial systems. Economic fallout, impact on global financial markets. Frankly speaking, the economic impacts would be severe. There would be massive stock sell-offs through Europe and North America as investors would panic over rising instability. As the EU is deeply connected with NATO in economic and security terms, any sudden collapse would lead to the crash of the euro. All kinds of businesses working in Europe would face uncertainty due to the volatile geopolitical situation. This means supply chains, energy security, and economic policies would all be disrupted. The cost of borrowing would increase as investors would fear security threats without NATO protection. Furthermore, major European powers would get in line to spend more and more on military and defense industries. The current NATO structure is largely dependent on the US, so much so that Washington bears 70% of its expenditures for defense. But with NATO's collapse, the US wouldn't be contributing a penny, so France, Germany, and other European states would feel the heat of the moment to bolster their own armed forces. For that purpose, Europe would have to spend 250 billion euros annually on defense to secure itself without the US's help. But this huge amount means there would be budget reallocations, and many other sectors would be deprived of funding like social services, healthcare, and infrastructure. Similarly, there would be increased demand for weapons and defense technology throughout Europe. Nations would get in line to purchase French and German weapons and artillery. Even though the defense industry would boom, there would be a significant imbalance between national defense and domestic priorities. Another dangerous economic repercussion would be an arms race, especially in nuclear weapons. Countries like Poland, Germany, and other small states would feel the need to make their own nuclear weapons. As the UK and France are the only two nuclear powers in Europe, they would also feel pressure to increase their nuclear capacities to fill the gap left by NATO. So there would be a high risk of nuclear proliferation and an arms race, which would ultimately increase the chances of regional conflict over any small issue. In light of the economic impacts of the arms race, there would be strategic realignments between multiple countries. Literally, every other country would think of making an alliance to safeguard its interests, and the first in line would be the US. Alliances and the risk of World War III. After NATO, the US would look towards another alliance of a kind that fulfills its purpose. It may look towards the Pacific, such as AUKUS, Australia, UK, and the US, and the Quad, US, Japan, India, Australia, to counter China's rise, so the US has other options on the table. However, the European Union may have to form its own EU-led security alliance and military force. Countries like Sweden and Finland, which have kept closer ties with NATO, might reconsider their collective defense strategies. While some European countries might form NATO-like military units, they wouldn't reach the strength and global reach of NATO. In the worst-case scenario, the absence of NATO could trigger a widespread conflict and might even lead to World War III. Moreover, every European nation would act unilaterally, which might increase the chances of military interventions in the region and resource-driven conflicts. In the aftermath of NATO, many global powers will struggle to form new alliances and military strategies. But the immediate consequences of this collapse will not be evenly felt. While some nations may have an alternative, others will find themselves in the most difficult situation, facing threats to security and sovereignty. Among them, the Baltic states will be the most vulnerable ones, the countries most affected by NATO's collapse. Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia would be the first in line for Russian aggression. Without NATO's strong umbrella, Russia could easily exploit them through military force or through hybrid warfare tactics. Other big powers like Poland, Germany, France, and the UK may also be the biggest losers as a result of NATO's collapse. Among them, Poland would be in the most dangerous position. It is a key NATO member in Central and Eastern Europe with the highest defense spending. While other members struggle to put up 2% of their GDP, Poland shares 4.12% of its GDP on defense, surpassing even Germany and France. Simply put, Poland is the front line of European defense, and if NATO collapses, it will be in a more dangerous position than others. Without NATO, any major Russian incursion into Ukraine will spill over into Polish territory. Then there is Germany, which would also be one of the biggest losers, not just militarily, but also economically. Since World War II, Germany has counted on NATO's protection while also maintaining its economic growth. Germany is the largest economy in the EU and the third largest in the world after the US and China. And all this progress is due to collective security and its defense priorities. However, without NATO, Germany would have to invest multiple times in defense, so its economy would suffer because NATO's collapse would cause a financial panic in the European markets and around the world. Then there are France and the UK, the only two military powers in Europe with nuclear arsenals at hand. Without NATO, both have to share the larger defense burden and ensure full support to Western Europe. Interestingly, French President Emmanuel Macron wants to do the same. He wants to build a European defense system free of any US influence and funding. To ramp up their own alliance without NATO, Macron said that Paris and London should lead Europe's new nuclear age. He said this after Donald Trump's controversial remarks about a possible NATO withdrawal, so Macron's statement hinted towards the idea that Europe should not rely solely on the US for the long term. That means a possible European alliance under France and the UK could be formed after NATO's scramble. Although it wouldn't fill the gap, it would still provide Europeans with the last hope from the Russian threat. But how much would it cost to defend Europe without the US? That is the question that haunts many European leaders. How would Europe cover it all? For many experts, it would need hundreds of billions of euros and large military personnel at its back. According to the estimates, Europe would need 300,000 more troops and an increase in annual defense spending of 250 billion euros to deter Russian expansion. If Europe somehow manages this huge budget and military, then its first priority would be defending Ukraine. European leaders know that Ukraine's experienced military is currently the most effective resistance against the Russian threat. So European leaders would step up their efforts to support Kyiv through military supplies. If we look at the macroeconomic numbers, it isn't that hard for Europe to replace the US support. Since the Russian-Ukrainian war, the US has provided around 64 billion euros to Kyiv, while Europe, including the UK, sent 62 billion euros. To replace the US, the EU would have to spend only 0.12% of its GDP, and that's a small amount. Moreover, this budget spending would give European leaders an advantage in the home conditions. On the contrary, the US will definitely lose important allies, military bases, and political power through the alliance framework. There are more than 40 US military bases that span the whole of Europe. All these military bases provide the US with the ultimate power on the continent. However, after NATO's collapse, Washington's geopolitical influence will undoubtedly be much diminished. So Trump's choice to distance the US from Europe may prove an epic blunder. Overall, America and its allies in Europe and beyond may suffer in a world without NATO. So, a fragile balance that kept the threat at bay for decades would be destroyed in days, leaving stakeholders in peril and continuous chaos. Do you think NATO's collapse will bring the world towards an era of unchecked aggression and uncertainty? Will it challenge the power struggle among global powers and steer them to the brink of World War III? Let me know in the comments section. Now, a related topic is Trump's foreign policy and how he damages the US's relationships with other countries. He does that at a rapid speed. It's truly baffling. Click here to learn more about this topic. See you next time.